He took me from darkness into light.
There are some terrible bruises.
Yes. He said you were a devil. He said you'd killed his son.
You were dreaming, Sister Martha. You must have had a dream before.
Martha, the past cannot hurt you.
But if thine eye needs evil, then thy whole body shall be full of darkness.
Martha's Story. Mr. Rose Virgins, next Wednesday, 9:25 on BBC Two.
On tonight's Late Show, British watercolours at the Royal Academy. Why 2,000 visitors a day can't be wrong. And Alice in a Musical Wonderland as rock legend Tom Waits teams up with Robert Wilson's Theatre of Spectacle.
First on BBC Two, Jeremy Paxman has this evening's Newsnight.
Boris Yeltsin and his turbulent Congress join battle to decide who rules Russia. Good evening. President Yeltsin, that master of political jugglery and bluff, survived what was billed as a probable power struggle to the death today. He may have to face the same thing tomorrow.
At the special Congress in Moscow, President Boris Yeltsin has come under fierce attack from his opponents. I'll be examining whether the continuing struggle for power is damaging this country's young democracy.
Who are the good guys and who the bad in this tussle for mastery of Russia, and whose side should the West be on? Congressman Jim Leach thinks we ought to do whatever we can to help Mr. Yeltsin or someone like him survive. This woman gave a lift to a hitchhiker and a decade later found herself arrested, strip-searched, and she says humiliated. What justification is there for today's renewal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act? Labour's Northern Ireland spokesman will be joined by the chairman of the Commons Home Affairs Committee to disagree profoundly. And we report from inside the Sellafield reprocessing plant, which has cost £3 billion to build and may never come into operation. Reports of the political death of Boris Yeltsin turned out to be greatly exaggerated today. He survived an attempt to impeach him and counterattacked with his own demand that the Congress of People's Deputies hand him control of the central bank. The Congress is a hangover from communist days and today even voted not to drop the tired old slogan about workers of the world uniting. But the Congress is nonetheless tonight said to be preparing to renew its attack tomorrow, and the President's plan to legitimize his claim to power in a referendum in April looks decidedly dodgy. There are dark hints that Yeltsin may try to outmaneuver the Congress by attempting to impose direct rule. Washington is watching this titanic clash with mounting concern. Mark Urban is in Moscow.
In a quiet street near the Kremlin, lorries concealing hundreds of Interior Ministry troops were ready for action in case the political tensions of the past weeks turned violent. In the end, they weren't needed. A few hundred demonstrators, former communists and the far right, had turned up, and they weren't in the mood for a riot. With the national anthem out of the way, Ruslan Khaspolatov, the parliamentary speaker and Boris Yeltsin's principal opponent, opened the Congress. He was soon baiting the president for his handling of their recent confrontations.
There's even been direct attempts to drag the army and security forces into politics. This is intolerable.
Congress is Russia's highest legal body. It dates from when communist control made it a rubber stamp. Now there's real debate. A third of the delegates support the president. About a third are communists and rightists who despise him, and the remainder oscillate between them. For months now, it's been deadlocked. Anti-Yeltsinites in Congress are strong enough to chip away the president's authority, but not to oust him. The result is frustration.
We should look beyond these windows and find out what the people want. They're tired of political confrontation.
As the Kremlin palace echoes to the sound of the Congress and its deadlocked politics, the reality of daily life in Russia goes on outside. There are signs that more and more people are getting tired of the stalemate and losing patience with their politicians. While Parliament and President argue about who should run the government and whether they should put the issue to a referendum, Russia carries on with 2,000% inflation.
All we've got now is a tussle for political power. No one's doing anything about improving the economy.
They're just fighting up there, and we don't understand what's going on. All we want is order and for things to work properly.
Is there a danger, do you think, if all this goes on for too long, that people will lose patience with democracy here?
Definitely, no doubt about it. That's if the majority haven't already lost faith in democracy.
To the old order, the newspaper Izvestia belonged to Congress's predecessor, the Supreme Soviet. Among the compositors and journalists here, there's little doubt who's to blame for the current crisis. Most support President Yeltsin and the reforms which gave their paper independence. Next month in court, they hope to defeat an attempt by his rival, Ruslan Khasbulatov, to bring Izvestia back under the control of his organization, one they prefer to call by its old communist name.
The Supreme Soviet, which is not actually a parliament, the Supreme Soviet with very strong communist tradition will insist on their current position. They will not share any power with the president, with the government, with other structures. But, of course, president will win if the referendum takes place. He will win, but nobody knows how big would be that majority.
As this evening's edition went to press, the paper perhaps wore its heart on its sleeve. Their headline, Congress rejects compromise and takes the path of confrontation. By this afternoon, that confrontation was fast consuming the time allotted to discussion of which questions should be put in President Yeltsin's referendum. He had hoped a popular vote would give him a mandate to reform. Faced with opposition last week, he hinted, perhaps unwisely given his credentials as a Democrat, that he might use unspecified final means to sidestep this body. Today his critics exploited those remarks.
The term final means armed violence. So in his fight with us, President Yeltsin is trying to maneuver us into making unconstitutional moves, to give him the opportunity for a creeping coup.
Some of the president's supporters believe Mr. Yeltsin may choose measures other than a constitutional coup to get his way.
Now it is time for the president to act again and act in a strong manner. I think that the best thing to do for him is to claim that he will pass the referendum based on his own responsibility.
One of President Yeltsin's toughest opponents believes the referendum is the anti-reform group's opportunity to get a vote of no confidence.
If President Yeltsin wants to experiment with a referendum, let him. But we should be clear now what the consequences for him would be, whatever the result. I think that even calling a referendum is a constitutional resignation by him.
Tonight in the Kremlin, Boris Yeltsin must contemplate his next move. He heard late this evening that Congress rejected out of hand a compromise resolution which he planned to put tomorrow. If his frustration drives him to bypass Congress, his reputation as a democratic leader may be tarnished. If he carries on working with them, he risks allowing all of his policies to sink in a political quagmire.
Mark Urban reporting. Well, in the last few months, Western governments have woken up to the realization that Boris Yeltsin has been so weakened by the unpopularity of his reforms that he could be toppled by the hardliners in Congress. The result has been a flurry of impressive declarations of support, but so far, no new money. When a beaming Boris Yeltsin met the G7 leaders last summer, he was granted a delay in repaying the $80 billion debt he'd inherited from the communists. But he was warned that he'd have to complete his economic reforms before he could expect much more. Now, belatedly, the West is realizing it might have been more supportive. As Yeltsin's power over the anti-Western, anti-reform hardliners has dwindled, the West has become increasingly worried that time for helping Russia may be running out. After Chancellor Kohl visited Moscow last week, he's reported to have written personally to European leaders urging them to support Yeltsin now and to confirm publicly that they'd back him if he was forced to suspend Parliament. In America, Richard Nixon last week put pressure on President Clinton to intervene. In a letter to the New York Times, he argued that it was in America's own long-term interest to bail Yeltsin out. If Boris Yeltsin's democratic government collapses, this will have a far greater impact on the American economy than all the Clinton domestic programs combined. The peace dividend will be down the tubes. The defense budget will have to be increased by billions of dollars rather than cut. Yesterday, Presidents Mitterrand and Clinton took his advice, suggesting an emergency meeting of the G7 nations before the scheduled Tokyo meeting in July to discuss how to help Yeltsin.
I don't believe we can wait until July for the major countries of the world who care about what happens in Russia and who would like very much to keep political and economic reform on track there to move.
Tonight, the British government backed the idea, leaving the Japanese, who have a territorial dispute with Russia, as the only major industrial nation opposing a summit to try to save Yeltsin. Well, joining us now from Washington is Congressman Jim Leach. Congressman, we know that many of the people at the Congress are superannuated old communists, but we also know that President Yeltsin has been playing footsie with the army. So who are the good guys, who are the bad guys?
Oh, I think we have to be careful about always identifying good and bad with individuals, but as a basic rule of thumb, Boris Yeltsin is the only elected president in 1,000 years of Russian history. The Congress with which he is competing is a very undemocratic holdover from the old regime. I think the West has no choice whatsoever but to identify with President Yeltsin.
Well, in practical terms, if that is the judgment that we should arrive at, what could be done?
Well, that is the question of the hour. I mean, in terms of emergency kinds of food and medical assistance, I think the West can respond very quickly. In terms of long-term economic assistance, some of it goes through the international development banks, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Some will be country to country, some might be a G7 orientation, but a heck of a lot has got to be whether or not there's a decision of really Western free enterprise to develop on a much quicker basis ties with this new fledgling, very poor country, Russia.
But this is a realization terribly late in the day on the part of the Group of Seven, and not just the United States, but Britain, France, the rest of us, have failed to get on board until absolutely the last minute, haven't we? Shouldn't we have been having this sort of conversation last summer?
Well, I think we have to be careful of our rhetoric. About $20 billion was given or lent or provided last year to Russia from the West in general. But in terms of the size, that seems like a lot. The question is how it's utilized. But the great overreaching kind of thought of the century is that we had two wars, World War I, World War II, and two models. World War I, we were punitive to the loser. We precipitated World War II. The question is whether we want to be generous to the loser of of the Cold War, the great World War III that wasn't fought. And I think we have an absolute obligation to be as generous as possible to make sure that a more conflicting situation doesn't arise in the not-too-distant future.
But even if we look at it purely from an American perspective, over the last 2 years, America's given something like $650 million. In that same period, you've given $10 billion to Israel and Egypt and written off $7 billion worth of debts. Now, that seems to argue, in practical terms, that you do not judge, your foreign policy establishment does not judge this to be a sufficiently high priority, doesn't it?
Well, I think there are apples and oranges in those figures. The $10 billion you're referring to is a loan guarantee of which there may be a minimal type of transfer of resources and potentially even none when you reference Israel. In terms of Russia, remember the West, that is Britain and the United States, have committed very massive resources through the International Monetary Fund, which is a collective kind of giving that also is of some significance.
But didn't we
having said all of that, it is a drop in the bucket.
But, I mean, didn't we make the mistake with Mr. Gorbachev of identifying a particular process with a particular individual and perhaps getting in too closely with one individual?
Well, I couldn't agree more that we have to be very careful about this identification with the individual. But at the moment, the only process in Russia which is democratic is that of the office of the presidency and the cabinet that has been set up under a democratic president. And so in terms of process, this is the only direction to go. In terms of the future, at the moment, the alternatives to Mr. Yeltsin seem to be of a less happy dimension.
Supposing
until alternatives of a happier dimension arise, I think Yeltsin symbolizes a kind of direction and type of reform that we in the West identify with.
Briefly, because I know you've got to rush off, but supposing Mr. Yeltsin were to decide tomorrow that he can't live with Congress anymore, he's going to have to overrule them, rule by decree, if he can get it with a collaboration of the army. Should we support him in doing that?
Well, that is going to create a very awkward circumstance. He obviously is in a very difficult position, and it throws into doubt the meaning of any rules or laws that would then precipitate. And that might make it very difficult for Western free enterprise to want to get to be too closely associated with a non-legitimatized type of rulemaking authority. I think what the West has to do is work as strongly as we can with the current situation and let time elect a legitimate legislature. But I think people ought to understand that there are some pluses to this illegitimate legislature for Yeltsin. He would be deeply unpopular if the alternative were more democratic.
Congressman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The House of Commons was more than usually tetchy today as the government asked MPs for their annual approval of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The release of news that police had discovered a large stash of homemade explosive in North London gave the debate an added topicality, not entirely coincidentally in Labour's view. But the edge came from the domestic political overtones. The fact that the Act has to be debated every 12 months is a recognition of its extraordinary nature. Although introduced by a Labour government, the parties voted against it for years. This time they wanted a reasoned discussion and amendments and ended up voting against again. Our political correspondent James Cox examines the arguments now on both sides.
Bombs seem to have become almost just another occupational hazard of urban life in Britain. After 20 years of terrorism, the bombers sometimes get through, and sometimes, as with today's discovery of a huge cache of explosives in North London, the security forces strike back. Government and police say that a crucial weapon is the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which, among other provisions, allows for security checks on people entering or leaving the UK. Powers of exclusion of suspected terrorists from Great Britain, which, say opponents, creates a system of internal exile unique in Europe. And powers of detention for up to 7 days without charge, with the permission of the Home Secretary. It's these last two which are at issue between the parties.
Well, I see, Madam Deputy
Labour
Speaker,
has, since 1983, opposed the annual renewal of the Act. This year, Shadow Home Secretary Tony Blair offered to cooperate with the government if these two clauses were reconsidered. Ken Clarke, a politician to whom consensus means agreeing with him, would have none of it.
It's no good the honourable gentleman standing up and looking steely-eyed and declaring that his position is so reasonable. He actually is trying to find reasons to carry on clinging to the year-in, year-out objections of his predecessor to the renewal of this Act, and he is actually opposing the renewal of important powers. To that extent, he is unintentionally, but nevertheless, in fact, giving great encouragement to Pyra and to others who find these powers. Yes.
Previous Tory Home Secretaries have supported the Act only reluctantly because of the infringement of civil liberties. Mr. Clarke insisted he was sufficient guardian of those.
Powers are obviously used carefully and with discretion. They are backed by established safeguards, which we keep under review all the time. But the key point is they continue to provide an important and necessary weapon in the fight against terrorism. And at a time when we are achieving successes, it really would be the height of folly to dispense with them.
Labour's new stance has been encouraged by Mr Blair to prove the party is not, as the Tories seek to paint it, soft on crime. But he still believed voting against the Act was justifiable.
If we merely accept in some sort of craven way that any act brought by the party opposite before us, entitled the Prevention of Terrorism, must be supported in its entirety, without question, and that anyone who dares to question it is a closet supporter of terrorism, then I say by adopting that attitude, we do not strengthen the fight against terrorism, we weaken the fight against terrorism. Because in the end...
And, goaded by Tory interruptions, he hit out at political partisanship.
The reason why the government refused even to talk to us about this legislation, despite our suggestions being supported by their own advisers and previously contemplated by them, is that crime is doubling, they're losing the debate on law and order, and they would prefer to disagree for the sake of the Tory party than agree for the sake of the country.
It was after the Birmingham pub bombings that a Labour government introduced the first version of the Act in 1974. But it's proved a broad and sometimes indiscriminate brush in sweeping up true terrorists. Since 1974, according to the Home Office's own figures, more than 7,000 people from Ireland, north and south, have been detained under it. But more than 6,000 have neither been charged nor made subject to exclusion orders. Only 115 have been convicted of offences so serious that they were imprisoned for more than 5 years. Teresa Balmain, a Limerick woman married to an Englishman and living in Hertfordshire, got caught in the net. During a holiday abroad, they gave a lift to an Irish hitchhiker and exchanged addresses. 9 years later, he was arrested for IRA offences on the continent. Mrs. Balmain and her husband were detained under the PTA, interrogated and searched.
What's the lowest thing you can get is a child killer, right? Now, if I'd been a child killer, they'd have had to come with a search warrant for my house. They'd have had to come and charge me. But because I'm Irish, they come and they use magic words, prevention of terrorism. And they can do what they like. They can take you away. They don't need no warrants. They take over your home. They can do with you what they like, even though I'm an innocent person.
It's experiences like that that lie at the heart of the real debate, party politics aside. How to balance the civil liberties of innocents like Mrs. Balmain against the threat of terrorism.
It is extremely vexatious. It is an infringement of our liberties. But we cannot go on treating terrorism as if it is some minor misdemeanor happening in an English shire in piping times of peace. We have a hideous menace to stability in society, and it has to be defeated. And that means surrendering, on a strictly controlled basis, some of our ordinary liberties.
In Parliament, Labour's shift of emphasis, dismissed by the Tories, was welcomed more warmly by the Unionists, though they said it still didn't go far enough.
Nonetheless, I hope that the Labour Party will continue to reconsider. I think there is a change of tone, certainly, between last year and this year. The Labour Party have reduced its objections from 3 last year to 2 this year. I hope this trend continues.
The Liberal Democrat Ming Campbell said Labour had made a good case against the Act, but he still believed it was a necessary evil to support it.
We should vote for it because it's a regrettable but necessary enhancement of police powers in an area in which they need special assistance.
Labour's former deputy leader and Home Affairs spokesman, who led the party's opposition in the 80s, said he now accepted the need for special measures, but
there are men who, on the Home Secretary's criterion, have done nothing for which they can be prosecuted, but it is necessary to arrest them in the belief that they may in some way which their Home Office and the police cannot describe be involved in the future commission of a crime.
What was this one? I refer to your detention.
The police now accept they made a mistake with Mrs. Balmain. She says that's the danger, that the PTA renders all Irish people vulnerable and if used heavy-handedly could even encourage sympathy for the terrorists.
Now, I'm apolitical. I've never even voted in my life. But just think if you had any sympathy that way and the police did that to you, I bet the IRA laughed their sides out, don't you?
Well, there's in the studio now Kevin McNamara, Labour spokesman on Northern Ireland, and Sir Ivan Lawrence, chairman of the Home Affairs Committee. It's obviously a question of balance of advantage and disadvantage. An act which is called the Prevention of Terrorism Act and has been in force for the best part of 2 decades and has demonstrably not prevented terrorism has clearly failed, hasn't it?
No, it's probably prevented a lot more terrorism happening than has happened. Because after all, if under these terms you can get information, you can get access to forensic science, you can do all the sort of things that are necessary to do in order to detect and to deter crime, then there would be a lot more terrorism going on. And there's no doubt in anybody's minds, in the police force or anybody who's been connected with it, that this act has been a success. It has deterred and stopped further terrorism.
Kevin McNamara, if the professionals, the police and the army and the intelligence services believe in this act, who are you to disagree?
Well, you must ask the Maguire family, you must ask the Guildford Four, you must ask Judith Ward, all of whom were arrested under the PTA, all who had false confessions made out of them, and who, as a result of that, brought into the question the whole of the rule of law and the way we deal with people in the United Kingdom. So you asked me the question, so I tell you the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that politicians are responsible for these sort of matters, and we are the people who take the decisions and we make the judgments. The professionals, in the end, have to operate according to our rules.
If it saved one life, is it not worthwhile?
The answer to that is you have to demonstrate that it has saved one life. That is yet to be shown. You have to show, well, you may pull that face, Jeremy, and sneer, but you have to show that any legislation other than the PTA would not have been successful in saving lives. And I put it to you that the majority of circumstances in which people have been arrested and charged could have been done under other legislation.
Lawrence, you're a lawyer by training. It must cause you considerable angst, must it not, to see a government seeking derogations from things like the European Convention and so on?
I'm not just a lawyer, I believe in civil liberties and human rights. But there comes a time when you have to modify those or set them aside to some extent for the greater good, and the greater good is to the prevention of slaughter that would otherwise go on to a much greater extent than it has gone on if we didn't have this kind of infringement of civil liberties. It is a balance, but it's clear which side the balance falls.
As Kevin McNamara says, you can't demonstrate it saved a single life.
No, well, it's very difficult to demonstrate prevention because people don't come forward and say I was deterred or I was stopped. But there is plenty of information which the police have access to, which shows that if they hadn't got the Prevention of Terrorism Act, a large number of people would not have been arrested, charged and convicted. The people who blew up the Grand Hotel in Brighton were arrested, charged and convicted under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and last year I think 38 of the people who were detained were charged under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and they wouldn't have been charged under any other piece of legislation.
The people who attempted those terrible killings in the Metropole and succeeded in Brighton were convicted of murder. Convicted of murder. They're convicted of attempted murder. They're convicted of conspiracy to commit murder.
But they
were all separate and other trials. When the police followed them through and they were arrested and brought to trial, yes, they were arrested under the Protection of Terrorism Act because that's a good, handy, motive name to use, but they could have been arrested under existing legislation.
No, they could not, because the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which gives the power of arrest, is not sufficient to keep these people for long enough on a prevention. You have to have a particular act, a specific purpose in mind before you can use the ordinary law. And so this is the extra, the necessary extra, which allows the police to detain and to investigate.
This goes to the heart of the changes you were seeking.
No, of one of the changes we're seeking. What we're saying is, yes, we understand that there may be need in order to detain people for a while longer. What we're saying is that after a certain reasonable length of time, the European Court suggests 4 days, those people should be brought before a magistrate. And those people, and reason given why those people should be detained. And that is a normal thing that happens under the law,
Why not let a judicial figure decide?
Well, Lord Colville, who is the independent assessor of the working of this, has advised the government that the judges should not be brought in. This is an administrative act, it's not a judicial act, it's under very close surveillance. Not only the authorities, but in Parliament, the Home Secretary can be quizzed about it and brought to task if he has done anything wrong. The Colville report, year after year, shows that the government is behaving properly in this, that the police are behaving properly in this, and that this is a very, very necessary measure. It takes many days to develop forensic tests. It may take many days to get hold of people to come forward and give information, and to take this power away from the police would be to undermine the defence against terrorism.
Well, that is, with respect, is a load of nonsense. All you have to do is take a person before a magistrate or a judge and say, Your Honour, we're waiting to get the result of forensic tests. On the basis of those tests, we believe that this person will be guilty. Or will be sufficient evidence will be found to charge them. All you've got to do is take a person before a magistrate and say, look, we wish to hold them for this while longer. This can be done in camera, but it does give a person an opportunity to go before a magistrate and for proper checks to be put upon what the administration is doing. And it's no good saying, Lord Covill says this and Lord Covill says that. We can quote Lord Covill to each other as much as we want. The point is that he was appointed by the government to examine the workings of the Act, not to criticise the Act, but to examine the workings of the Act, and the government was behaving properly.
What have you got to fear from a magistrate?
It's the interference. It's the interference of the judiciary into a purely administrative act, which interferes with the whole process of the legal system. We don't want our judges making administrative decisions. We need our judges to make decisions according to the law. And when Lord Colville says
and the question would be whether
there are reasons why,
being held.
May I just finish? There are reasons why judges should not be introduced. That is an advice which the Home Secretary would be foolish to ignore.
All right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you. In a moment, the £3 billion nuclear reprocessing plant that may never open. Before that, though, a quick look at some of today's other news stories. The Italian Prime Minister, Giuliano Amato, has won a vote of confidence after chaotic scenes in the Italian Parliament. Ushers had to intervene to stop fighting between senators as Mr. Amato rose to make a speech about the corruption scandal that's rocked his government. During parts of his speech, he couldn't be heard about the calls for him to resign by opposition politicians. A man has been shot dead tonight in North Belfast. The man was working in a chip shop in the Old Park Road area when a gunman ran in, fired a number of shots and then escaped in a car which was later found abandoned in the largely nationalist Ardoyne part of the city. The Glamorgan Health Authority has confirmed reports that a junior doctor who worked in hospitals across South Wales died of AIDS almost 6 months ago. The authority said it didn't tell the public because the risk of patients was virtually nil. On the markets, the 100-share index closed up 7 points at 29.57. On Wall Street, the Dow reached a record for its third day in a row, climbing 6 to 34.78. On the foreign exchanges, the pound fell over a pfennig, closing at 2 marks 39.4. In New York, the pound fell 0.6 cents to $1.43.4. Well, now a riddle. What's twice the size of Wembley Stadium, cost £3 billion, took 15 years to build, and yet may never come into operation? The answer is Thorpe. It stands for Thermal Oxide Reprocessing Plant, the world-beating facility at Sellafield built to recycle nuclear fuel. The government has to make a decision within the next few weeks. British Nuclear Fuel says the plant could make a profit of £500 million over the next 10 years. Its opponents say it's obsolete. If Thorpe does turn out to be a white elephant, it will be a stark example of scientists dancing to politicians' tunes and finding world-class solutions to problems which no longer exist. Ian Carson reports.
On the Cumbrian coast at Sellafield sits a £3 billion nuclear factory, finished a year ago. It's called Thorpe, built to reprocess fuel for a generation of power stations that haven't materialised. So Thorpe stands idle, and tons of nuclear waste, much of it from overseas, lie waiting. The delay is costing £2 million a week, while an argument goes on behind closed doors in Whitehall about whether Thorpe should be allowed to start or simply be abandoned. The thousands of local people who depend on British nuclear fuels for their livelihood know Thorpe will be their future as the older parts of Sellafield wind down.
Thorpe is the new business, and Thorpe is the new age as far as the nuclear industry goes. And if Thorpe doesn't go ahead, then obviously the long-term effect is very serious. What we've got is a building that's actually been built is ready to go. We've got a good team of people ready to operate the building, and it appears to us that it's purely politics that's actually holding it up.
Thorpe was dreamt up in the heyday of the nuclear industry, the mid-70s. Japan asked Britain to reprocess its spent nuclear fuel at Windscale, as Sellafield was then known. A public inquiry under Lord Justice Parker, seen here visiting Windscale, gave enthusiastic approval to building the new plant. Oil prices had quadrupled, and nuclear power was seen as the energy of the future. What's more, reprocessing would salvage uranium and produce plutonium, both then scarce and expensive. 15 years after it was first given the go-ahead, this is Thorpe today. Once it's switched on, chopped up nuclear fuel rods, highly radioactive, will pour down this feed tube, ready for reprocessing. It's British technology, and it's the world. But since its inception, the world has changed. The uranium to be produced here is now surplus to requirements. Britain, like other countries, has turned its back on expanding nuclear power. As the price of uranium fell dramatically, Thorpe's raison d'etre started to crumble, and the cheaper option of simply storing the waste without removing the uranium began to look attractive. As early as 1985, there were doubts. The House of Commons Environment Committee recommended a wholesale re-examination of the project. The chairman now wishes they had gone further.
Well, with hindsight, with the changes that have taken place since then, the additional costs, the difference in political perception of nuclear power post-Chernobyl and all the rest of it, then I think, yes, if we'd known all those things at the time, we would have taken a more robust view and been more positive in our statements to government, to Parliament,